Hello, I'm Colin Macdonald. I've been involved in the games industry for about 30 years this year, mostly on the development side. I ran a small 8-bit studio in the 90s. I was producer on the first couple of early Grand Theft Auto games. Then I was a co-founder and studio manager of Real Time Worlds up in Dundee. Then in 2012, I moved around the table by joining Channel 4 as their games commissioner. I now run Indie Champions as an independent publisher. I'm commercial director of Rivet Games up in Stirling. I'm advisor to facial animation specialist Speech Graphics, as well as the UK Games Fund. And since COVID hit, I've been doing the Games Jobs Live events as well, which has been a lot of fun. When I joined Channel 4, instead of following their tendency to do open briefings that dozens of developers would pitch for, I'd instead only ask 4 or 5 different developers to pitch. My process was pretty simple. For each TV show, I'd find out 2 things: who the core demographic was and what the essence of the show was. To use the show Made in Chelsea as an example, I'm sure you're all fans. The demographic was young and female, but amazingly, even the companies making the shows often don't have a good understanding of what the essence of their own properties is. To the average viewer, Made in Chelsea is about rich folk getting drunk in exotic locations and sleeping around. But this production company absolutely knew the real essence of the show, which was the exchange of gossip. The drink, the exotic locations, and the sleeping around was just detail. It was about gossip. So I knew that I needed a game whose genre had mechanics that suited the exchange of gossip and would appeal to the young female demographic. So for each show, armed with those 2 bits of information, I would literally just spend an afternoon going down a spreadsheet that I'd compiled of all the studios in the UK that I knew about. And for each and every one, I'd considered whether they could be a good match for the show I wanted to make a game of. Several I approached, after talking about one genre that I thought was a good fit for a show, would send a proposal for a different genre of game entirely for some reason. And as I didn't think the genre was a good match for the demographic, there's no way I can commission that. So when I would ask them why they'd changed away from something that I'd said I'd liked, they said they thought the original game just wasn't one they wanted to make, which I respected and is absolutely fine, but I don't think they should have wasted their time pitching something they knew I wasn't going to commission. It's a bit of a waste of everyone's time. So despite my amusement, I think I agree with the fundamental point that developers will produce the best results when it's a game they really want to make. And whilst many of us need to earn our passion by turning our hands to whatever we can when we need the business, those are rarely the games that become the most successful. The best games do usually come from an underlying passion. The job of the person pitching to the likes of Channel 4 or investors or publishers is to be enthusiastic and to be convincing of the passion that will go into making this project. Yet many a great project has been declined because the publisher thinks, well, if the developer isn't enthusiastic about it, how do they expect anyone else to be? The job of the investor, or Channel 4 in my case, is to gauge whether the enthusiasm is sincere, which is why I found it difficult to do deals having only met business development folk, because it was hard to judge that sincerity. That's their job. They don't have to make the game. And it's also why I never commissioned from any companies that identified themselves as digital agencies rather than just as game developers. In other industries, there's a trend towards the seller-doer model, where BizDev isn't a separate function, but an aspect of production, with a project manager responsible for pitching to savvy clients that want to build and keep a relationship with the people that will actually be delivering the project. That's not to say a developer can have its most senior staff pressing the flesh at every event going, certainly not at the moment, but someone needs to do that. Conventional wisdom is that it takes at least 5 encounters with someone to close a deal. So you do need someone out and about or online or whatever it is, and it can't be a shrinking violet. I've seen events where all the Brits would stick to their own cliques and corners of the room and perhaps only made a couple of new contacts, but a single extroverted American would work the room, giving their elevator pitch to everyone and collecting everyone's contact details in return. You can imagine who probably had the better hit rate in terms of getting their pitches in front of interested parties. To start becoming a familiar face to decision makers, you have to keep in touch with people. We need to hunt for good excuses to keep in touch. Don't be like one developer I spoke to had a great meeting with a publisher at GDC, but 6 months later, when I asked them how things had developed, they kind of just shrugged and said they felt the ball was in the publisher's court and they hadn't had any contact since. Do chase things up. Some developers will email a few times a year to talk about cool stuff they've developed, purely as a way of keeping in touch. My own variation is I do a games opportunities newsletter. I send it every month, and it lists funding and awards, opportunities, and anything else I think developers will be interested in. And the fact that it's useful to my target audience of indie developers, it's why it's now grown to over 1,500 studios that get it every month. And as well as it being useful to them, which just makes me feel good inside, my name landing in all those inboxes every month reminds them about my Games Jobs Live events or anything else I want to make sure gets in front of them. Pre-COVID, I hosted a series of Scottish developer events. Every couple of months, I'd get everyone together in Dundee, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. And they were a brilliant excuse to regularly email my contacts at publishers, investors, and platform holders. I'd invite them up to speak and to meet everyone. And again, because it's of value to them, they generally seem grateful for the contact, and it wasn't just me spamming them every month. It was something that gave them value that they were interested in. Although it's easy to become annoying by pestering people, I had one developer used to ask to meet at every single conference I went to, even when we'd only met a week or two previously at a previous conference, and there was no follow-up to do. They just seemed to be filling their slots and trying to use up my time. But the desperation suggested that no one else wanted to commission them either, and it wasn't a good look. What I generally recommend before wasting a valuable publisher meeting or even spending any time developing something is a simple focus test of your concept. Just take an elevator pitch for the game you want to make and make up 2 other vaguely credible elevator pitches and run them past colleagues, friends, family, and ask them which sounds most interesting. And you've got to be honest with yourself in judging whether they're politely telling you that their favorite sounds good, or do you really see their eyes light up and they're really enthused and they really want to find out more. And if the one they get excited about is not the one you want to pitch, maybe you need to think about changing that. One of the developer meetings I admired the most was where they didn't use the meeting to pitch a single idea. They just grilled me on every aspect of what I was looking for. Rather than take 100-to-1 shot on a random pitch, they were arming themselves with all the information they needed to come back later with dramatically increased odds because they had a deep understanding of what I wanted. Getting an understanding of budget appetite is particularly important. And interestingly, what I hear publishers say more than anything else is that a budget was too low. Obviously, they're not inviting developers just to whack a zero on the end. What they're actually saying is that the game isn't ambitious enough for their aspirations. It has to be credible, but think big. Get folk interested, get folk excited. They want to sign the next big thing. They've got to believe that you have the ambition and the game will be resourced well enough to make it the next big thing. If they don't have the budget, they'll not be slow in asking you to think of creative ways of delivering the essence of it for a little bit less, trust me. One upside of Brexit, I guess, is how much the pound is devalued. To a foreign investor paying in dollars or euros, we're maybe 25% cheaper than we were 4 or 5 years ago. UK developers are renowned for their technical and creative excellence, and now we're able to give overseas publishers a chance to tap into that at a far better rate than ever before. So don't just hit up the folk that you know are nearby or in the same country, particularly when everyone's online and all the conferences globally you can get to from your living room. Tap up everyone, think big, think global. To give you a couple of quick do's and don'ts for the pitch itself, I do recommend having a one-line elevator pitch and drumming it into people. If they're interested in progressing the conversation, they need to sell it to their own team, whether it's up or down or across. They're your champion, so make sure they can do justice to your pitch. Don't use up the entire meeting slot pushily pitching. Leave at least half the time for the actual conversation. Too many people run out of time with a minute to go, and it just leaves no time for any proper conversation or any follow-up questions. So keep your pitch relatively short, but let someone expand on the areas that are of interest to them. Don't ever boast of playing lots of games. For some reason at Channel 4, various folk, while pitching me, thought that in some way this gave them a great credibility that they would somehow make a great game. I've watched Formula One for decades, but that doesn't qualify me to drive for Ferrari. Do capitalize things like Xbox and PlayStation correctly. If you can't get that right in a pitch deck, I won't have much confidence of you passing cert easily. And these are all things that people you're pitching to will be very aware of. As well as the usual things that I'd be looking for in terms of capabilities and experience, there's 3 specific things that I always looked for. Firstly, I'd always ask developers what the best game they made was, and I'd spend time playing it myself. Realistically, they're probably not going to produce something for me that was dramatically better than that. Hopefully a little bit better, but it's not going to be dramatically better. So understand what you're likely to be getting from a developer. Secondly, I'd want to see developers playing to their strengths and sweating their assets. Building on existing tech means development is faster, more reliable, produces a more fun game, not to mention it's cheaper, more profitable, etc. And after, why would I commission a Match 3 studio to make an FPS game or vice versa? It would make no sense. And thirdly, I would look for how willful a developer was. Few publishers want to work with prima donnas. I had one who felt their version of a licensed character was better quality than the original and were difficult about changing it. That's not a fight you're going to win. But equally, I also didn't respect developers that were overly pliable. I've been on calls where I've mused whether doing something differently might be better. And then I'd find it later that the developer immediately started implementing it. I'm looking for developers to think for themselves and push back if I suggest something that doesn't actually make sense for the game. And this was essentially the secret to my success at Channel 4. It was as simple as getting the right game made by the right developer, rather than just whoever talked the best talk or whoever landed on the doorstep next. Where a pitch isn't successful, few developers seem to bother asking for feedback. And whilst you might not agree with it, and you almost certainly won't like it, but if you're going to win more pitches, you need to listen to feedback and you need to look for trends. You'll often get fobbed off with, it's just not right for us at the moment, or something else, but try and make it easy for people to be brutally honest. Get them to admit whether they thought you weren't experienced enough, whether you're too expensive, too cheap, too timid, too cocky, whatever it is. The more you can learn about that decision process, the more you'll increase your chances of winning the next one. But don't make it easy for someone to lie to you. Don't get defensive. Worst case, say you just appreciate the feedback. Always leave things on good terms. This is a really small industry in many ways. And because people talk and move around, I know various developers that have burnt a bridge without realizing they'd effectively burnt dozens. Do take all feedback with a pinch of salt, though. History is littered with infamously bad rejections. Two of my favourites are George Orwell's Animal Farm, which was called a stupid and pointless fable, and Walt Disney being fired from an early job because he lacked imagination and had no good ideas. Above all, persistence is key. Most games, books, films, musical bands that we now think of as epic were probably rejected dozens and dozens of times. So please don't give up too easily. Do persevere. We may have the next Beatles, J.K. Rowling, or Tarantino of the games industry watching this today. And I hope that sharing some of my experiences will make it a little bit more likely that I get to play their masterpiece. If I can help anyone with anything, I'm not hard to find on Twitter or LinkedIn, or drop me an email. Thank you very much.